The cold October wind rattled the windows of the small aircraft as Captain David Chen checked his instruments one last time. Everything looked good. Fuel tanks full, weather report pulled up on his tablet, and cargo secured in the back. Just another Tuesday afternoon in Alaska, he thought to himself. David had been flying these routes for 15 years now. 15 years of navigating through mountain passes, dodging storm clouds, and landing on strips of frozen ground that most pilots wouldn't even consider runways. His logbook was filled with thousands of hours, and his reputation among the locals was solid. When you needed something delivered to the middle of nowhere, you called David. Today's job was straightforward. He had medical supplies, some fresh food, and a few boxes of equipment heading to a mining camp about 200 miles northeast. The miners had been waiting for this delivery for over a week. Bad weather had grounded all flights, but this morning brought a break in the storms. A narrow window of clear skies, maybe 4 or 5 hours before the next system rolled in. His wife Amy had kissed him goodbye that morning like she always did. 20 years of marriage, and she still worried every time he flew. She understood the job, though. Someone had to do it. These remote communities depended on pilots like David to bring them everything from medicine to mail. "Be careful out there," she'd said, handing him his thermos of coffee. "The weather report says another storm tonight." "I'll be back before dinner," he'd promised, squeezing her hand. "Easy run. I've done it 100 times. Their 2 kids were already at school. His daughter Katie was 13 now, talking about maybe becoming a pilot herself someday. His son Tommy was 10 and more interested in hockey than aviation. But both of them loved hearing their dad's flying stories, especially the close calls and dramatic landings. David climbed into the cockpit and ran through his pre-flight checklist. Every switch, every gauge, every control surface got checked twice. That's what kept you alive in bush flying. Not luck, not instinct. Careful, methodical preparation. The engine roared to life, and he felt that familiar vibration through the seat. After all these years, it still gave him a little thrill. There was something pure about flying, something that made him feel truly alive. Up there, it was just him, the plane, and the endless sky. He radioed the tower, got clearance, and taxied to the runway. Within minutes, he was climbing into the gray October sky, Anchorage falling away beneath him. The city looked small from up here, a tiny cluster of buildings surrounded by mountains and wilderness that stretched in every direction. The first hour of the flight was routine. David followed the valleys and ridges he knew so well, keeping an eye on the weather ahead. Dark clouds were building on the horizon, but he had time. The GPS showed him right on schedule. He'd reach the mining camp with at least an hour to spare before the weather turned bad. He thought about his plans for the weekend. Tommy had a hockey game on Saturday. Katie wanted to go shopping for winter clothes. Amy had been talking about finally painting the kitchen. Normal, everyday family stuff. The kind of things that made all these long flights worthwhile. The landscape below was stunning, even after seeing it thousands of times. Vast forests of spruce and pine, their branches heavy with early snow, frozen lakes that looked like mirrors dropped into the wilderness, rocky peaks that scraped the clouds. This was Alaska in all its harsh, beautiful glory. David adjusted his altitude slightly, climbing to 8,000 feet to clear a ridge. The plane handled smoothly, responding to every touch of the controls. He knew this aircraft like he knew his own hands. Every rattle, every sound, every quirk. They'd been through a lot together. He checked the cargo behind him. Everything was still secure. The medical supplies were especially important. The mining camp's doctor had radioed ahead specifically about those. Someone had gotten injured. Nothing life-threatening, but they needed proper medical equipment. David felt good knowing he was helping people, even in this small way. The radio crackled occasionally with chatter from other pilots. Weather updates, position reports, the usual back and forth. The flying community in Alaska was tight-knit. Everyone knew everyone, and they all looked out for each other. More than once, David had helped guide a lost pilot to safety, and other pilots had done the same for him. About 80 miles from his destination, David started his gradual descent. The mining camp had a decent landing strip, nothing fancy but long enough and well-maintained. He'd probably spend 20 minutes on the ground, just long enough to unload and grab a quick cup of coffee in their mess hall. The snow was falling harder now, not quite a storm, but definitely getting thicker. Visibility was dropping. David wasn't worried, though. He'd flown in much worse. As long as he could see the ground, he was fine. And he knew every landmark along this route. That crooked river, that abandoned cabin, that distinctive rock formation shaped like a bear. He glanced at his watch. 3:45 in the afternoon. The sun would be setting soon, and with the cloud cover it would get dark fast. But he'd be on the ground at the mining camp in 15 minutes, easy. David reached for his coffee thermos and took a sip. Still warm. He smiled, thinking about Amy insisting he take it. She always took care of the little things. That's what made their marriage work. All the little things adding up to something solid and real. The mining camp radioed in. Bush 42, this is Northern Light Camp. We have you on radar. Weather's getting rough here. How's your approach looking? Northern Light, this is Bush 42, all good on my end. I'll be setting down in about 12 minutes. Have the coffee ready. Copy that, Bush 42. We'll have the welcome committee waiting. David grinned. The welcome committee usually meant 3 or 4 miners eager to unload the cargo quickly, so everyone could get inside before the weather got worse. They were good people, these miners. Hard workers who spent months at a time in the wilderness, away from their families, doing dangerous work. He leveled off at 6,000 feet and prepared for his final approach. Everything was going according to plan. Just another routine flight, another delivery, another day in the life of an Alaska bush pilot. That's when he saw it. Just a flash, really. A brief glimpse of something red against all that white and gray below him. It was so quick he almost thought he'd imagined it. Maybe a reflection on his windshield. Maybe his eyes playing tricks after staring at snow for 2 hours. But something made him look again. David's hand instinctively moved to bank the plane slightly, trying to get another look at whatever he'd seen. But the moment had passed. Below him was just the same endless white landscape, trees heavy with snow and the gray afternoon light making everything look flat and colorless. He shook his head. Probably nothing. After this many hours in the air, your mind could play tricks on you. He'd seen phantom shapes in clouds before, thought he'd spotted things that weren't there. The human brain was wired to find patterns even when there was nothing to find. Still, something bothered him about it. Red didn't belong out here. Nature didn't make that kind of bright artificial red. Not in October in Alaska. The berries were long gone. The fall colors had faded weeks ago. Everything down there should be white, gray, brown, or dark green. That flash of red stood out like a warning flare in his memory. David checked his fuel gauge again. He had plenty to make it to the mining camp with reserves to spare. The weather was holding barely. Snow falling steadily now, but not the blinding whiteout conditions that could ground a plane in seconds. His logical mind ran through possibilities. Could have been a piece of trash blown by the wind. Could have been a tarp from a hunting camp. Could have been absolutely nothing at all, just his tired eyes misreading the landscape. But his gut told him something different. In 15 years of flying, David had learned to trust his instincts. There were times when the instrument said everything was fine, but something felt wrong. Those were the moments that separated experienced pilots from dead ones. Your gut knew things your conscious mind hadn't processed yet. He thought about Amy's words that morning. Be careful out there. She always said that. Every single flight. It was her way of saying I love you without making him worry about her worrying. The mining camp was expecting him. They needed those medical supplies. Someone was hurt and waiting for treatment. The miners would be standing in the cold, ready to unload his cargo the second he touched down. But what if someone else was down there? What if that flash of red was a distress signal? David's thumb hovered over the radio button. He could call it in. Report what he'd seen. Let the authorities handle it. That was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. He had a job to finish, a schedule to keep, a family waiting for him at home. He pressed the button. Northern Light Camp, this is Bush 42. I'm going to circle back for a minute. Thought I saw something. Static crackled for a moment. Bush 42, say again. You're breaking up. I'm making a quick pass back over my route. Spotted something that doesn't look right. Shouldn't take more than 10 minutes. There was a pause. David could imagine the miners looking at each other, checking their watches, glancing at the darkening sky. Copy that, Bush 42. Be advised weather is deteriorating rapidly. We've got maybe 30 minutes of decent visibility left. Understood. I'll be quick. David banked the plane around, his eyes scanning the terrain below. He tried to remember exactly where he'd been when he saw it. There was that distinctive bend in the frozen river. That cluster of 3 hills that looked like giants' knuckles. He'd been right about here. He dropped altitude, bringing the plane down to 5,000 feet. Lower meant better visibility, but also meant fighting the wind gusts harder. The plane bounced and shuddered as pockets of turbulent air grabbed at it. Come on, he thought. Show me what you are. The snow was coming down heavier now, making it harder to see. David squinted through the windshield, his pulse quickening. This was getting risky. He should turn back. He should complete his delivery and report what he'd seen when he got to the mining camp. But what if waiting meant the difference between life and death for someone? He made another pass, slower this time, the engine straining as he fought to keep the plane steady in the increasingly rough air. His eyes moved methodically across the landscape section by section, the way he'd been trained to search for downed aircraft. There. His heart jumped. A small frozen lake, maybe a quarter-mile across, and on that lake something that definitely didn't belong. A splash of bright red against the ice. Not just a glimpse this time. He could see it clearly now that he knew where to look. David circled tighter, dropping even lower. The wind buffeted the plane, but he held it steady. His training took over. Years of experience guiding his hands on the controls without conscious thought. Next to the red object, he could make out something else. Wreckage. Dark shapes on the white ice that looked like scattered debris. And then his stomach dropped as he realized what he was seeing. A plane. A small aircraft broken and partially collapsed through the ice on one side. Oh no, he whispered. He could see 2 figures now, small dark shapes moving near the wreckage. One was waving, both arms over their head in the universal signal for help. The other figure was sitting or lying down, barely moving. David's mind raced. This changed everything. This wasn't just an instinct or a maybe. These were real people in real trouble, and he was probably the only one who knew they were there. He grabbed the radio. Northern Light Camp, Bush 42. I've got a situation here. There's a downed aircraft approximately 80 miles southwest of your position. I can see survivors. 2 people. Repeat, I have visual confirmation of survivors. The response came immediately, the dispatcher's voice sharp with concern. Bush 42, can you confirm? You're saying you found a crash site? Confirmed. Small aircraft, looks like it went through the ice on a lake. I'm transmitting GPS coordinates now. His fingers moved across his navigation system, marking the exact location. Copy that. Bush 42. Stand by. David continued circling while the dispatcher contacted search and rescue. He didn't want to leave these people. Didn't want them to think they'd been abandoned again. As long as they could see his plane, they'd have hope. The radio crackled back to life. Bush 42, we're contacting Coast Guard rescue. Nearest helicopter is grounded due to weather conditions. They can't fly until morning at the earliest. Morning. That was 15 hours away. In this cold, in this weather, 15 hours might as well be forever. What about ground rescue? David asked, though he already knew the answer. They're mobilizing now, but terrain is extremely difficult. Best estimate is 6 to 8 hours to reach that location. Maybe longer with the weather. David looked down at the 2 figures on the ice. One was still waving weakly. The other hadn't moved. 6 to 8 hours. They'd been down there for who knows how long already. How much longer could they survive? His fuel gauge caught his eye. He had enough to make it to the mining camp, deliver his cargo, and return to base. That was the plan. That was the job, but could he really just fly away? David thought about Katie and Tommy. What would they say if they knew their dad had seen people in trouble and just kept flying? What would Amy think? More importantly, what would he think of himself? He keyed the radio again. Northern Light, this is Bush 42. I'm looking for a place to set down near the crash site. Negative, Bush 42. Repeat, negative. You are not equipped for rescue operations. Your orders are to continue to Northern Light Camp and deliver your cargo. David's jaw tightened. Orders. Yes, he had orders. He also had a conscience. Northern Light, those people won't make it 6 hours. I've got emergency supplies on board. I can at least keep them alive until ground rescue arrives. Bush 42. You are flying a cargo plane, not a rescue helicopter. The nearest safe landing zone is over 2 miles from that crash site through heavy forest. This is not your responsibility. But David was already studying the terrain below, his experienced eye picking out possibilities. There, a frozen riverbed, running roughly parallel to the lake. It looked solid, relatively smooth. Narrow, lined with trees, but maybe wide enough. Maybe. It was a crazy idea. landing a plane on an unmarked, unprepared frozen river in deteriorating weather. Every rule in the book said don't do it. His training screamed at him to turn around, but those people down there had no one else. David took a deep breath. His hands were steady on the controls. He'd made his decision. Northern Light, I'm going in. The radio exploded with voices. The dispatcher at Northern Light Camp was practically shouting, telling David to reconsider. Another voice, probably the camp supervisor, was demanding he follow protocol. Someone else was trying to patch through the Coast Guard. David turned the volume down. He needed to focus. He brought the plane around in a wide arc, studying the frozen riverbed from every angle. It ran roughly east to west, maybe half a mile long before it curved into dense forest. The width looked decent, probably 100 feet across at the widest point. Trees lined both sides like walls, their branches reaching toward each other over the ice. The problem was, he couldn't tell how solid that ice was. From up here it looked smooth and white, but looks could be deceiving. Thin ice meant crashing through into freezing water. That would turn a rescue mission into a double fatality real quick. But he didn't have much choice. This was the only possible landing spot within miles of the crash site. Everything else was either too rough, too steep, or covered in trees too thick to navigate. David reduced speed and dropped to 3,000 feet. The wind pushed hard against the plane, making it shudder and drift. He compensated automatically, his hands moving on the controls with practiced precision. 15 years of flying in Alaska weather had taught him how to read the wind, how to feel what the air was doing. He circled lower. 2,000 feet now. He could see individual trees, could make out the texture of the snow on the ice. The riverbed looked relatively smooth, no major obstacles visible. That was good. But smooth didn't mean safe. At 1,000 feet, David began his final approach. His heart was pounding now, adrenaline singing through his veins. This was the point of no return. Once he committed to landing, there was no backing out. He thought briefly of Amy. If something went wrong, if he didn't make it back, she'd be furious with him. Furious and heartbroken, but she'd also understand. That's why he loved her. She got who he was, what mattered to him. The plane dropped through the heavy snow, visibility shrinking to just a few hundred yards. David kept his eyes locked on the riverbed ahead, watching it rush up to meet him. The trees on either side seemed to close in, making the landing strip look impossibly narrow. His left hand adjusted the throttle. His right hand held the yoke steady. His feet worked the rudder pedals, keeping the plane aligned perfectly with the river. Everything had to be exact. 1 degree off and he'd clip a tree. Too fast and he'd overshoot. Too slow and he'd stall and drop like a rock. The skis on his landing gear touched the ice. For a heart-stopping second, David wasn't sure if the ice would hold. He felt the impact through the entire frame of the plane, a jarring thud that rattled his teeth. Then the skis bit into the snow-covered surface and held. The plane bounced once, hard enough to lift David out of his seat against the seatbelt. He fought to keep it straight as they came down again, skis scraping and sliding on the ice. The trees on both sides blurred past in his peripheral vision, close enough that he could see individual branches. The plane slid forward, momentum carrying them down the frozen river. David applied the brakes carefully, not too hard or they'd lose control completely. The tail started to swing left. He corrected with the rudder, brought it back in line. 50 yards left before the curve in the river. The plane was still moving too fast, 40 yards. He could see the wall of trees at the end of the straight section rushing toward them. 30 yards. More brake. The skis groaned in protest, 20 yards. Come on, slow down, 10 yards. David held his breath. The plane shuddered to a stop with maybe 30 feet to spare. For a long moment, David just sat there, hands still gripping the controls, breathing hard. His shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cold. He'd done it. Against all odds, he'd actually done it. David quickly ran through his shutdown checklist, then grabbed his emergency kit from behind the seat. Thermal blankets, first aid supplies, flares, rope, his satellite phone. He pulled on his heavy parka and gloves, then pushed open the door. The cold hit him like a physical blow. The temperature had dropped dramatically, probably well below zero now. The wind cut through his layers of clothing, finding every gap, every opening. This was the kind of cold that could kill you in hours if you weren't prepared. David climbed down from the plane and immediately sank knee-deep in snow. Great. This was going to be slow going. He oriented himself, checking his handheld GPS. The crash site was roughly a mile northwest of his position, through a forest that looked thick and unwelcoming. He took a moment to mark his plane's location with a bright orange flag attached to a telescoping pole. If the weather got worse, he'd need to be able to find his way back. Getting lost out here was a death sentence. Then he started walking. The forest was brutal. Snow had drifted between the trees, creating deep pockets that threatened to swallow him with every step. Branches grabbed at his parka, slapped at his face. His breath came out in great clouds of vapor that froze instantly in the air. David checked his GPS every few minutes, making sure he was heading in the right direction. In conditions like this, it was incredibly easy to get turned around. People had wandered in circles for hours in less severe weather than this. His mind kept going back to those two figures he'd seen from the air. Who were they? How long had they been out here? The fact that at least one of them was moving was a good sign, but the other one had been still. Too still. 20 minutes into his trek, David's legs were burning. The snow was exhausting to walk through, each step requiring enormous effort. Sweat ran down his back, which was dangerous. Wet clothes in this temperature meant hypothermia. He had to keep moving, had to get to those people quickly. He thought about Katie and Tommy again. What would they think of what he was doing? Would they be proud? Or would they think their dad was being reckless? He hoped they'd understand someday that some choices, even dangerous ones, were worth making. The trees began to thin out. David pushed through a final cluster of pines and found himself at the edge of the frozen lake. There, maybe 200 yards away, was the crash site. The plane was a small Cessna, similar to thousands of others flying in Alaska. It had clearly tried to land on the lake, probably in an emergency. But the ice had given way under one wing, and now the aircraft was tilted at a crazy angle, half submerged in the freezing water. Next to the wreckage, David could see the red jacket that had saved these people's lives. Someone had weighted it down on solid ice as a signal marker. Smart thinking. Without that bright splash of color, David never would have spotted them. And there were the survivors. An older man was kneeling beside someone else, a woman who was wrapped in what looked like a sleeping bag. The man looked up as David approached, and the expression on his face was something David would never forget. Pure desperate hope mixed with disbelief. "Help," the man called out, his voice cracking. "Please, we need help." David quickened his pace, half running across the ice. As he got closer, he could see how bad things were. Both people looked terrible. Faces pale and drawn, lips tinged blue. The man was shivering violently. The woman wasn't moving at all. "I'm here," David said, dropping to his knees beside them. "I'm here now. You're going to be okay." The man grabbed David's arm, his grip weak but desperate. "She's hurt bad." 3 days. "We've been here 3 days. I didn't think anyone would find us. 3 days. In this weather." It was a miracle they were alive at all. David pulled out his emergency kit and got to work. First priority was the woman. He checked her pulse. Weak but steady. Her breathing was shallow and her skin was ice cold to the touch. Severe hypothermia, definitely. Possibly other injuries, too. "What's your name?" David asked the man while he worked. "Robert. Robert Patterson. This is my wife, Helen. We were flying to visit our daughter in Fairbanks. Engine failed. I tried to land on the ice, but..." His voice trailed off. David wrapped Helen in one of his thermal blankets, then another. He needed to warm her up, but slowly. Too fast could be as dangerous as the cold itself. He activated 2 chemical heat packs and placed them carefully against her core. "Robert, I need you to stay with me, okay? I know you're cold and tired, but I need your help here." Robert nodded, though his eyes were glazed and unfocused. He was hypothermic, too, just not as far gone as Helen. David pulled out his satellite phone and called for emergency services, providing them with exact coordinates and a medical assessment. The response was what he'd feared. Ground rescue was still hours away. The helicopter couldn't fly in this weather. They were on their own until morning. David looked at the darkening sky, then at the 2 people who were depending on him. He'd found them. Now he had to keep them alive through what was shaping up to be the longest night of all their lives. David's first priority was shelter. The wind was picking up and the temperature was dropping fast. Sitting out in the open would kill them all before morning. He looked around, assessing their options. The crashed plane was partially flooded, making it useless as shelter. But nearby there was a small outcropping of rocks with some overhanging trees. Not perfect, but it would block some of the wind. It would have to do. "Robert, can you walk?" David asked. The older man nodded slowly. "I think so. I've been moving around trying to stay warm." "Good. I need you to help me move Helen. We're going to get set up over by those rocks." Together, they carefully lifted Helen, still wrapped in the thermal blankets. She was small, maybe 120 pounds, but in the deep snow every step was a struggle. David's muscles screamed with effort. Robert stumbled twice but kept going. They reached the rocks and David quickly set up a makeshift shelter. He pulled out a lightweight emergency tarp from his kit and used rope to secure it between the rocks and trees, creating a windbreak. It wasn't much, but it cut the wind significantly. Next came the fire. David gathered dead branches from under the trees where the snow hadn't completely buried them. The wood was damp, but he had fire-starting chemicals in his emergency kit. Within 10 minutes, he had a small flame going. Within 20, they had a real fire. The difference was immediate. The heat felt like a blessing, pushing back the killing cold. David positioned Helen close to the fire, but not too close. Robert sat beside her, holding her hand. "Talk to me, Robert," David said as he worked. "Tell me what happened." Robert's voice was weak, but he needed to stay alert. Talking would help with that. "We left Anchorage 3 days ago. Morning flight. Weather was supposed to be clear. It changed fast. Real fast. We were about an hour out when the engine started making this noise, this terrible grinding sound. I'm not a mechanic, but I knew it was bad." Robert paused, staring into the fire. "I radioed for help, gave our position. Then the engine just quit. Complete failure." David nodded, encouraging him to continue while he checked Helen's pulse again. Still weak, but maybe slightly stronger than before. "I saw this lake and thought if I could just get us down safely, we'd be okay. Someone would find us." Robert's voice cracked. But the ice broke. The plane went through on Helen's side. Water came flooding in. "It was so cold, so fast. How did you get her out?" "I don't really remember. Adrenaline, I guess. I just knew I had to get her out of that water. Pulled her through my door, dragged her away from the plane." Robert looked at his wife, tears forming in his eyes. "She hit her head during the crash. She's been in and out of consciousness since then." David gently examined Helen's head, finding a significant bump behind her left ear. Possible concussion, maybe worse. Combined with the hypothermia and 3 days of exposure, she was in serious trouble. "You did everything right, Robert," David said firmly. "That red jacket was brilliant. Without that, I never would have seen you. That was Helen's idea before she got too weak. She said someone might fly over. Said we needed something bright." Robert squeezed his wife's hand. "She's always been the smart one." David opened his emergency rations and handed some to Robert. "Eat this. I know you probably don't feel hungry, but your body needs fuel." Robert took the food mechanically, chewing without really tasting it. David made himself eat too, though his stomach was tight with tension. He kept checking his satellite phone, hoping for an update on the rescue team. The hours crawled by. David kept the fire going, burning through his supply of dry wood and then having to venture out into the storm to find more. Each trip away from the shelter was brutal. The wind had become a living thing, howling and clawing at him. Snow fell so thick he could barely see 5 feet ahead. Helen remained unconscious, but her breathing seemed a bit steadier. David changed out the heat packs regularly, monitoring her temperature. Too cold was deadly, but warming too fast could cause her heart to stop. It was a delicate balance. Robert talked more as the night wore on. He told David about their daughter in Fairbanks, about their grandchildren they'd been flying to see. He talked about his 40 years working as a teacher, about Helen's career as a nurse, about their life together. "We've been married 38 years, Robert said quietly. 38 years and I can't lose her now. Not like this." "You're not going to lose her," David said with more confidence than he felt. "Help is coming. We just have to make it through tonight." Around midnight, David's satellite phone rang. He grabbed it quickly. "This is Chen." "David, this is the Coast Guard coordinator. How are conditions there?" "We're holding on. Female patient is critical but stable. Male patient is hypothermic but responsive. I've got a fire going and we're sheltered from the wind. Good work. Ground rescue team is making progress, but terrain is extremely difficult. They're estimating arrival at your location around 6 a.m. Weather should clear enough for helicopter extraction by 7. 6 a.m. That was still 6 hours away. 6 more hours of keeping these people alive, keeping the fire going, fighting off the cold that wanted to kill them all. "We'll be here," David said. After he hung up, Robert looked at him with haunted eyes. 6 more hours? "We can do this, Robert. We've made it this far." But as the night deepened, David wasn't so sure. His supply of dry wood was running low. The fire was their lifeline, and if it went out, they were done. He'd have to venture further into the forest to find more fuel, which meant leaving Robert and Helen alone longer. Around 2 in the morning, Helen stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. "Robert?" she whispered. "I'm here, honey. I'm right here." Robert's voice broke with emotion. Helen's gaze wandered until it found David. "Who?" "This is David. He's a pilot." "He found us, Helen. We're going to be okay." Helen tried to speak again but couldn't manage it. Her eyes closed and she drifted back into unconsciousness. But it was something. A sign that she was still fighting. David stood up, pulling his parka tight. "I need to get more wood. Keep talking to her, Robert. Even if she can't respond, she can hear you. Keep her anchored to us." He ventured back into the storm, his flashlight cutting a weak beam through the swirling snow. The cold was unbelievable now, so intense it made his lungs ache with every breath. His fingers were numb even inside his gloves. His face felt like frozen leather. David gathered what wood he could find, breaking dead branches off trees, pulling fallen logs from under snowdrifts. His body moved on autopilot, driven by pure will. He thought about Amy, about Katie and Tommy. He'd promised them he'd be home for dinner. That seemed like a lifetime ago now. When he returned to the shelter, his arms loaded with wood, Robert had tears streaming down his face. "She spoke again," Robert said. "She asked about our daughter. She's worried about missing her birthday next week." David added wood to the fire, building it back up. "Then we'll make sure she's there for it." The wind howled louder, as if angry that they were still alive. Snow piled up around their shelter. David's watch seemed to move backward, each minute stretching into an eternity. 3 a.m. came and went. Then 4. David kept the fire burning, kept checking Helen's vital signs, kept Robert talking and alert. His own exhaustion was becoming dangerous. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been this tired. Around 4:30, David heard something over the wind. A sound that didn't belong to the storm. He stood up, listening hard. There it was again, voices, faint but real. "Hello," David shouted into the darkness. "We're here, over here." Lights appeared through the trees, flashlight beams cutting through the snow. Then figures emerged from the storm, 4 of them in heavy rescue gear. "Thank God," David breathed. The rescue team moved with practiced efficiency. A paramedic immediately took over Helen's care, starting an IV and checking her vitals. Another medic examined Robert. The team leader clapped David on the shoulder. "You did good, pilot, real good. These people would be dead if not for you." David nodded, unable to speak. The relief was overwhelming, threatening to drop him where he stood. But he couldn't collapse yet. Not quite yet. The team leader was already coordinating with the helicopter. "Weather's clearing. We can extract in about 90 minutes. Can you make it back to your plane?" David looked at his GPS. A mile back through that forest in his current state. It seemed impossible, but he'd done impossible things before. "Yeah," he said, "I can make it." The trek back to his plane was the hardest mile David had ever walked. His body was running on fumes now, every muscle screaming in protest. The rescue team had offered to escort him, but they needed to stay with Robert and Helen until the helicopter arrived. David was on his own. He followed his GPS and his earlier tracks, though the wind had already started filling them in with fresh snow. The forest seemed darker now, more menacing. Or maybe that was just his exhaustion talking. He'd been awake for nearly 24 hours, most of it spent fighting for survival in sub-zero temperatures. David stumbled over a hidden root and went down hard, face first into the snow. For a moment, he just lay there. It would be so easy to stay down, to rest for just a minute. The snow was almost comfortable, like a cold blanket. No, he forced himself up. Amy was waiting. Katie and Tommy were waiting. He had to get home. He pushed forward, one foot in front of the other. His plane appeared through the trees like a miracle, exactly where he'd left it. The orange flag whipped in the wind, a bright beacon of hope. David climbed into the cockpit and just sat for a moment, breathing hard. His hands were shaking as he ran through the pre-flight check. Everything looked good. The plane had weathered the storm just fine. Now he just had to get it back into the air from this frozen riverbed. Taking off was going to be even more dangerous than landing had been. The snow had drifted across the ice, creating uncertain conditions. He had maybe 300 yards of relatively straight river before that curve. It wasn't much room for error. David started the engine. It coughed once, twice, then roared to life. The sound was beautiful. He let it warm up for a few minutes, checking his instruments. Everything was reading normal. He radioed the Coast Guard. "This is Bush 42. I'm preparing for takeoff from the riverbed location." "Copy that. Bush 42. Be advised the helicopter is inbound to the crash site." "ETA 15 minutes. Understood." "Tell Robert and Helen I'll see them soon." David took a deep breath and released the brake. The plane started forward, skis sliding on the snow-covered ice. He pushed the throttle forward, giving it more power. The trees on either side blurred past. 50 yards. The plane was picking up speed, but not fast enough. 100 yards. "Come on, lift 150 yards." The curve was coming up fast. David pulled back on the yoke, feeling for that magical moment when the plane would decide to fly. 200 yards. Still on the ice. Still accelerating. His heart pounded. 250 yards. The curve was right there, trees waiting to tear his plane apart. And then finally the skis left the ice. The plane rose into the air, clearing the trees by what felt like inches. David let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He was airborne. He was alive. He'd done it. The flight back to Anchorage took 2 hours. David contacted the mining camp to explain what had happened and arrange for his cargo to be picked up later. They were understanding, even grateful that he'd found the Pattersons. When he finally touched down in Anchorage, the sun was just coming up, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. David had never seen anything more beautiful. Amy was waiting at the hangar. She must have gotten the call from the Coast Guard. The moment David climbed down from the plane, she ran to him and threw her arms around him. "Don't you ever do that to me again," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "When they called and said you'd landed on a frozen river in a storm, I thought I'd lost you." "I'm sorry," David said, holding her tight. "I had to." "I know," Amy said, pulling back to look at him. Her eyes were red from crying, but she was smiling. "I know you did, and I'm so proud of you, but you scared me to death." Katie and Tommy came running over, having been held back by one of the other pilots. They crashed into David, both talking at once, asking a million questions. "Dad, they said you saved people. Did you really land on a river? Were you scared?" David hugged his kids, feeling the warmth of his family anchor him back to reality. "I'll tell you all about it. But first I need about 12 hours of sleep." The story hit the news that same day. By evening, David's phone wouldn't stop ringing. News channels wanted interviews. The governor's office called to congratulate him. Other pilots from all over Alaska were reaching out, but David just wanted to rest. He spent the day sleeping, waking up only when Amy brought him food. Katie and Tommy sat on the bed, watching him like he might disappear if they looked away. 2 days later, David visited the hospital. Robert was being treated for severe frostbite and hypothermia, but the doctors said he'd make a full recovery. Helen was in ICU but stable. The head injury had been serious, but she was going to survive. David walked into Robert's room quietly. The older man was awake, staring out the window. When he saw David, his face lit up. "You came," Robert said. "Of course. How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck, but alive thanks to you." Robert's eyes got wet. "Helen's going to make it. They said if you hadn't found us when you did, if you hadn't kept us warm through that night, we'd both be dead." David sat down in the chair next to the bed. "That red jacket saved you. I almost didn't turn around, but you did. That's what matters." Robert reached out and gripped David's hand. "You gave up your safety, risked your life for 2 strangers. I don't know how to thank you for that. You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad I saw that flash of red." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Robert spoke again. "The doctor said Helen should be awake in a few days. She's going to want to meet you properly." "I'd like that." David visited Helen a week later. She was out of ICU and sitting up in bed, looking tired but alive. Her daughter was there, a woman in her 30s who hugged David the moment he walked in. "Thank you," she kept saying. "Thank you for bringing my parents back to me." Helen's voice was weak, but her eyes were clear. "I remember you from that night. You were at the fire, You wrapped me in blankets. You were pretty out of it, David said. I remember thinking an angel had found us, Helen said with a small smile. Turns out you were just a stubborn pilot who wouldn't ignore what he saw. 3 months later, David received a medal from the governor for valor and heroism. The ceremony was formal and uncomfortable. David didn't like being the center of attention. But Katie and Tommy were so excited and Amy looked so proud that he endured it. At the ceremony, he gave a short speech. I'm not a hero, he said. I'm just a pilot who saw something that didn't belong and made a choice. We all face choices like that, moments where we can turn away or turn toward. I hope that if any of you ever see that flash of red, whatever it might be, you'll choose to turn around. Robert and Helen attended the ceremony. Helen was using a cane and still had some recovery ahead of her, but she was alive. That was what mattered. After the ceremony, David went back to work. He flew the same routes, passed over the same frozen lakes and rivers. But something had changed. He paid more attention now, watched more carefully. That flash of red had taught him something important about paying attention to the world around you. The red jacket that had marked the crash site now hung in David's hangar. Robert had insisted he keep it. It served as a reminder that small things matter. A piece of bright fabric. A moment of doubt. A decision to turn around. On quiet days at the hangar, David would look at that jacket and think about how close he'd come to flying past. How easy it would have been to dismiss what he'd seen, to convince himself it was nothing. He thought about all the choices that had led to that moment. Helen's idea to use the jacket as a signal. Robert's determination to keep them both alive for 3 days. David's decision to trust his instincts over his schedule. Amy asked him once if he'd do it again, knowing how dangerous it had been. David thought about it for a long time before answering. Yes, he finally said. Every time. Some things are worth the risk. Katie did become a pilot. She's in flight school now and she tells everyone that her dad is her hero. David still argues that he was just doing what needed to be done. But deep down he knows that moment defined something important about who he is. The story became part of Alaska flying legend. New pilots hear about it in training. It's used as an example of both courage and the importance of emergency preparedness. Search and rescue teams across the state now carry bright red emergency markers as standard equipment. But for David, it's simpler than all that. It's about paying attention. It's about caring enough to turn around when something doesn't look right. It's about being the kind of person who sees someone in trouble and doesn't look away. Every time David flies over that frozen lake now, he thinks about Robert and Helen. They're back home, recovered and grateful. They visit David and his family every few months. Their grandchildren call him Uncle David. And sometimes when the light hits just right and he sees a flash of color below, David smiles. Because he knows he'll always be the pilot who turns around, the one who looks twice, the one who cares enough to risk everything for strangers who need help. That flash of red changed 3 lives that day. And in doing so, it proves something important about human nature, that sometimes the smallest things, the briefest moments, the quickest decisions, matter more than we could ever imagine. All because one pilot chose to turn around.